Empathy can be found in nature. Altruism can be found in nature. So can you find violence, and so can you find murder. But how do we isolate one value from the other? How do we create a future of humanity that is non-predatory, and a future of humanity that is empathetic, a future of humanity that is more certain for not only human animals but also non-human animals, that provides more certainty and well-being and welfare for more and more species on this planet?
What are the things that pushes us to create better systems, to find vaster ways to be human?
The biggest problem of social justice are accumulated vestiges of bad social contracts, bad behaviors, bad cultural and moral policies, and legal policies that have been accumulated, that emerged, and that were written, that were accepted and agreed upon in times of profound ignorance, and have carried on that evolved in times of Stone Age and have been carried on in times of Space Age.
To employ our intellectual capacities towards systemic compassion, and that is really the most exciting thing to think about and imagine and ideate on.
So, from your own, context and experience, what do you think are the narratives that we could potentially give young people coming through?
That the next 5 billion people on this planet have access to food, water, shelter, comfort, dignity, education, enlightenment, opportunity, like the first 2 billion almost do. That's a singular question in front of us, staring us. And that means, how do we ensure that there is gender equality? How do we ensure that there is, how do we do away with the vestiges of caste and class? How do we do away with the really bad consequences of this semi-useful software that we invented a few centuries ago called money?
Hi, welcome to this edition of What If Reflections, where we are inviting the creative community, the artist community, to help contribute to the reimagining of the purpose of education. What If is an opportunity for us to take a pause and reimagine ourselves, our education system, and our world. And today I'm so glad that we have with us Anand Gandhi, Khushbu Ranka, and Vishal Galveja. Anand Gandhi is a filmmaker and entrepreneur, deeply interested in philosophy, evolutionary psychology, innovation, and the future. Ship of Theseus, his first feature, premiered at TIFF 2012 and has since been recognized as the most significant film to come out of India in decades by critics and audiences alike. It was presented the National Award in 2014. It has won prizes at the international film festivals, many of them. He's also now the founder and CEO of the Goa-based new media studio and systems think tank, Nemesis Lab, Nemesis Culture Lab, that works at the intersection of science, philosophy, and culture. Khushbu Ranka has had experience in the fields of journalism, graphic design, and writing for a number of years before she moved to filmmaking. Continuum has been her first short film she wrote and directed at just the age of 20, won the Best Short Film at the Hanover Film Festival. She also co-wrote the internationally acclaimed fiction feature film Ship of Theseus. Her versatility gave rise to her latest projects, An Insignificant Man, which is her first feature documentary film, and also a political documentary that is an intimate portrait of the birth of a political party in India. And Right to Pray, a must-watch, a unique virtual reality experience, the first of its kind from India, and an account about a group of female actors combating regressive patriarchy. Vishal has co-founded Dream a Dream, a charitable trust empowering children and young people from vulnerable backgrounds to overcome adversity and flourish in the 21st century using a creative life skills approach. Dream a Dream has been recognized among 10 champions in the world that reimagine learning through play in the 21st century by Ashoka Foundation and Ashoka and Lego Foundation. And they've also been recognized by 100 among 100 global innovations. An Ashoka Fellow, an Eisenhower Fellow, and a board member of India Cares Foundation. Vishal also actively writes about developmental challenges and human interest stories, and is also a poet. Before we move on into the discussion, the exploration that we're going to have today, I wanted to invite Vishal to give a little bit more context into why there was a need, why they felt the necessity to pause and reimagine. Vishal.
Dream a Dream has been around for about 20 years, and our focus has been for the last 20 years to change the conversation around education specifically for children who grew up in some kind of vulnerability and adversity. And our work has been focused on helping children develop their own sense of identity, develop agency to be able to take on their own life choices, and have the skills and capacities to overcome adversity and respond to life in a more positive and healthy manner. And we've done that using art and play as core pedagogical approaches. We have now slowly started integrating our approaches across education systems, in teacher training, curriculums, school reforms. So what happened when the pandemic hit the country and the country went into lockdown is one, there was this panic that set in the education community that children are going to lose out, which led to huge push towards digital education, virtual classes, to just digitization of content, which is amazing to see just how this value around it. But what we felt was that that wasn't the right approach. We were still kind of jumping into more of the problem rather than kind of rethinking of the solution. So we actually chose to take a pause as an organization, as a group, and said, let's just go within ourselves and see what's happening to us. This is the first time a pandemic has hit the globe, and all children across the world have been impacted. So what is happening? And of course, we have now read enough stories of how the impact of the pandemic, beyond just the learning loss, has been so much more on children's mental health, emotional well-being, trauma, of course, loss of livelihood, hunger, and all the related issues. But more importantly, it showed up the systemic inequities and structural barriers that were already in education before the pandemic, but really showing up now. And basically realizing that our education has failed a large chunk of our children and continues to fail a big chunk of our children. So then from that pause, the question we really asked ourselves was, what is going to be our most compassionate offer to our children in this pandemic? And once we start coming out of this pandemic, are we going to go back to cramming up syllabus and trying to push children to an education system that's failing there? Or could we use this as an opportunity to reimagine the purpose of education to an idea of thriving? So that was really the start of it. And Sucheta, who's the CEO at Dream, and myself wrote a series of articles around it. And we found a lot of resonance to it from people around. People from 30-odd countries started reaching out and saying, this is resonating with our thinking, let's do something together, which led us to building this global movement called What If, which is really an invitation to what is a reimagination around education. And a key element of that, why Padmaja and Art Flute came on board, was that we need to hear narratives and voices that are coming from all sides. And most importantly, especially in difficult times, the voices of artists have been the ones that have really shaped our thinking, shaped narratives, shaped conversations. So how do we bring in artists into this fold, into this movement, and have them show us the way through their art, through their narratives, into what could be a reimagination of education? So that was really the context.
For the purpose of this conversation, right, and for the purpose of the next 45 minutes, we wanted to really look at the idea of thriving, right? Because even when you look at the Dream a Dream's work, it has been centered around for every child a thriving life. And Anand, in your talk, in multiple talks, and also the latest talk that you gave for the class of 2020, you've been speaking about this non-predatory world where every being can thrive, right? So, and also if I look at Khushbu's journey itself, right? And Khushbu, I want to know much more about you than what I have got my whole hand on. But just the fact that, and both of you being dropouts, right, at 18, and both of you choosing what you wanted to do, and I'm going to kind of refer to Khushbu's as well here, that your response to what's happening has been through the medium of writing and cinema, right? Whether it is with The Insignificant Man, or whether it is with The Right to Pray, or much more work that you've been doing. There is this sort of a seeking to thrive in your own way, right? So I think that's my first question that I want to kind of breathe into. What is your idea of thriving when you've brought it up in your talk, or in your reference to this whole non-predatory world, which seemingly looks impossible? No, sorry, difficult. But I just want to hear more about that.
The moment we start peeling the notion of what is right, the question of what is ethical, what is moral, we start very quickly walking on. We start very quickly drawing lines on sand, and because the moment you say, okay, let's build a world that is equal for who? Biology has not evolved to be equal. In fact, the premise of evolution on this planet is inequality. The evolution that we are all consequences of is based on variation, is based on the fundamental principle of inequality, that there will be unequal advantages and disadvantages that every individual and then every species and every gene pool would have towards its environment. And some would be better suited for the environment, some would be lesser suited for the environment, and the ones that are better suited for the environment would most likely inherit the environment, and the meek would not indeed inherit the earth. For 240,000 years, humans lived more or less in ways that were not very dissimilar to ways of other animals, other non-human animals. But something happened down the line. We accumulated information, we accumulated knowledge systems, and we invented the ability to produce food at will, to not have to hunt and gather like other animals, but to actually produce food using our knowledge systems, using our sciences, around 10 to 14,000 years ago. In a post-agrarian human society, an instinct started evolving. The instinct that there is going to be plenty for everyone. Now that food is not scarce, now that we don't have to hunt and gather like all the other animals, all the other non-human animals, humanity has separated itself from the burden it carried in its vestigial natural form, in its jungle form, the jungle Raj can be shed from humanity. There can be a human Raj. There can be a new kind of society, a new kind of civilization that is very, very different in its codes, in its fundamental codes and fundamental rights than the codes that we inherited from nature. So nature is replete with murder and coercion. There is not a single individual in nature, with the exception of photosynthesizing and chemosynthesizing creatures. There are really very few species on the planet that do not survive, that can survive without killing something or someone every day. Now that's when you really look at that fact, it really starts questioning our notion of going back to nature and wanting to have this entire idea for the last few decades that we flirted with, that maybe humanity has come too far, maybe you have become too synthetic in our approach, maybe we need to all go back to the trees. It really challenges that notion profoundly, because if anything, we have come a long way to run away from our predatory instincts, not to create more predatory instincts. But of course, we also in our process of creating a civilization that is in its approach, in its aspiration, non-predatory, which means that it will not depend on having to kill something or someone every day. It will not depend on having to steal something from someone every day. It will not depend on it will not depend on biological biological differences on a uh, at a generation to generation on a generation to generation basis, but it'll depend on new technologies, new principles. And by technologies, I mean political technologies, social technologies. Social contracts are also technologies. The idea that we have come together and agreed to behave in a certain way collectively, and then we create a group of people who enforce that policy, they enforce that social contract. That is also technology. That is a software that we produce, and then we play that software out unto us. So politics, constitution, social contracts, and material technologies also, to ensure that we can alleviate suffering in many ways by just producing food, by redistributing food, by producing methods of redistributing methods of opportunities for life and dignity to everyone. Now, these aspirations were intuitive for the longest time. We conflated them with other aspirations for the longest time. If you look at the last 2000 years of social justice, whether that came in the form of early religious justice or eventual justice that emerged out of democratic states, democratic societies, there was a lot of conflating of aspiring to a world that is non-predatory, while always privileging what is natural, what is more natural to us. I think now we have arrived at a point where we are able to, with the help of the sciences that we have at our disposal, we're able to really clearly create this distinction between natural and human designed. Now, for the longest time, human design was criticized. Human design was intuited to be inferior to what is natural, what is pre-human. We don't need to see the world in that way anymore, because if you look at the civilization that we have built, if you look at the civilization that humans have built, we have managed to shed a lot of vestiges that we inherited from nature, and a lot of these vestiges are vestiges of predatory behavior. We have managed to create a society, create a world where there is more and more certainty for more people. There is more food for more people. There is more opportunities for more people. There is more healing for more people than nature would have provided for. So anthropologist Margaret Mead, she was asked by one of her students, what is the mark of, when you're studying old cultures, when you're studying ancient cultures, what's the mark of seeing if that culture was civilized or not, if that culture had reached a certain advanced stage of civilization or not. And the student was expecting her to respond with some kind of technology, whether there would be some kind of surgical tools or some kind of advanced pottery, and she said the singular mark of an advanced civilization, to look out for an advanced civilization, the singular mark of that is a healed femur bone. In most animals, when the femur bone is fractured, when most mammals that have the longest part of the thigh bone, when that bone is fractured, the animal can't move, and there is absolutely nothing that the animal can do to fend themselves from in the face of danger or to get themselves any food. A civilization, a culture that has designed and mandated political infrastructure, cultural infrastructure that will ensure the healing of such an individual, which may take something around, and for humans, which may take up to months or years. And in a cultural infrastructure that has ensured the healing of the femur bone, surely is a consequence of an advanced civilization. So when I talk about systemic empathy versus individual empathy, now empathy can be found in nature. Altruism can be found in nature. So can you find violence, and so can you find murder. But how do we isolate one value from the other? How do we create a future of humanity that is non-predatory, and a future of humanity that is empathetic, a future of humanity that is more certain for not only human animals, but also non-human animals, that provides more certainty and well-being and welfare for more and more species on this planet. And to do that, we need to isolate our instincts from our sciences. Our instincts also allow us to adapt and transform. All animals on the planet all life performs two activities. One is life transforms the environment around it, and life adapts itself to its environment. These are essentially the two sciences that every life carries within itself. Every form of life carries within itself. Humans also carry it, but we are able to pass on and store our sciences non-biologically through memories that we store not in our biology, not in our genes and our brains, but in our language, in our culture, in our codes, now in our computers, now in our cloud systems. So we have the ability to amplify our knowledge systems that other animals, of course, don't. And with that, we can isolate our sciences that can promise wellness and welfare and longevity for most animals on this planet, and diminish our predatory behaviors. In fact, limit our predatory behaviors, manipulate our predatory behaviors, hack into our predatory behaviors to ensure that we reduce suffering on the planet. That's really the premise of what Khushbu and I've been talking about.
Yeah.
Also at the center of it is the idea of free will as well. Like, how much are you able to negotiate against your genetic sort of predisposition? And a lot of the, drawing of boundaries around free will and what makes us human, and what in any instance makes us extraordinary, is very intrinsically linked to this idea of non-predatory behavior. Like, if you look at the most iconic political images of the last few centuries, whether it's the man standing in the Tiananmen Square with a bag of oranges against in front of a tank, or whether it's Gandhi picking up a pinch of salt against the British, or it's the planting of the flag on the moon, or whatever. The idea being that what were the two sides in those instances? It's always this idea that on the one side, the very clunky systemic sort of side of things, which often will say that no, better things are not possible, and then the other side, which is courage, and which is this, in the one instance, to do something that will change the world, and that inspires the world to change. And those actions are always unexpected, and pushing the envelope of what it means to be human, or what it could mean to be human. And I mean, for me, it's that. For me, like, even whenever Anand talks about it, like, Anand has obviously a much more a rigorous perspective on this. For me, as someone who's like very much moved and motivated by politics, that's what it comes down to. Like, what are the things that pushes us to create better systems, to find vaster ways to be humans on this planet.
Thank you so much, Khushbu. I think what's beautiful is that I'm hearing, like in what you shared, is that it can also come down to that one moment during which that response is happening, right? And that response can be of confrontation or of courage. Yeah. While at the same time, in what I'm hearing Anand share is more the longer term thinking in terms of bringing in the systemic change, and therefore how do we build that empathetic systems, right? In the whole idea of building this empathetic system, there is also, in both your work, in both your sharings, right? I've also heard much about questioning oppression, right? And not hesitate to question oppression, right? Anand, in the words you've shared, you've said that, but Khushbu, more in terms of the work that you've done, right? Whether it's The Insignificant Man or even The Right to Pray, there is that your response has been of making, creating, and questioning, right? So do you see a conflict between the two, of questioning oppression and in that process creating an empathetic system? Or do you feel it's kind of like a flow that's happening in the work that you're creating, or in the responses that you are meting out?
On one hand, I have the privilege of being, a male person born of a certain, born in a certain social hierarchy that predated my existence in this region. And on the other hand, so that way I'm a part of the majority, and hence the privilege of that majority. And the other hand, I'm a minority. I'm a part of the minority community in this region, which is one the most endangered, most at danger minority community in this country, which is rationalists, which is atheist, irreligious rationalists. Clearly, one of the most at danger minority communities in this region or any region in this world right now. So in that there is this constant negotiation that I experience, which is that of, I mean, the talk that you refer to, I do mention, I mentioned that idea that you should be at the liberty to swing your arm, but the liberty to swing your arm ends at the tip of somebody else's nose. And most negotiations that happen in policy and law are about the imaginary boundaries between the arm and the nose. There is in democratic societies there is this constant there is a constant challenge to the swinging of arms as having struck imaginary noses, and the burden of proof does not necessarily always lie on the nose. It often lies on the arm, which comes at the cost of personal liberty, which comes at the cost of human free will and human choice, which easily is the singular thing that separates our species from every other.
There is protest, but I think there's also negotiating with the system. There's also negotiating with existing structures, and trying to sometimes hoodwink them into behaving better. And often it's also about changing in people through individual conversations. There's this group in the US who does this thing called deep canvassing. So they go to they what they did is their state voted against a gay marriage, and so they went door to door to have long form conversations with everyone who voted against that. And so they were essentially talking to people who hated them, right? Because most of them were gay, the people who were going door to door. And so they engaged in these long form conversations, which was fairly designed. The idea was to change people's mind through these conversations. And after this entire exercise, when the voting happened again, actually that state ended up passing the law for gay marriage. The protagonists of our film, I think it's been an interesting journey to see how they've also changed, and they've also changed their way of discourse while being in politics.
Experiencing the tension in these conversations is fascinating. I actually want to deep dive or kind of further reflect on Anand. You spoke about the future of humanity as being certain well-being oriented, welfare oriented, non-predatory. And I was intrigued by the idea of non-predatory as opposed to, say, empathy based. So you're not saying empathy based, but you're saying non-predatory. What does that mean when you say non-predatory, and which does it equal to an empathy-based society, or is not an empathy-based society but is not predatory? Second, just wanted to kind of pick on this, since we're talking about the future of societies and how systems are designed around compassion, which Khushbu, you spoke about, how could we design systems for compassion? In our own work with young people growing up in difficulties, we've seen that we've done very good in being able to build their capacities to show up in the world with confidence and agency. And what we realized is that that's not been enough, because there are, of course, environments around them which create barriers, conditions, and unless we remove some of those systemic barriers, stereotypes, biases, any kind of building of agency and capacity can only go that far, and still probably works for the top 10% of the most vulnerable. So we have been actually sitting on this whole question of looking at the intersectionality of empowerment itself, and moving away from the language of empowerment to now moving into walking into the language of justice. And in your own work and in your own thinking, what has been that thinking for you? Those two questions.
Whatever little contribution I can make to this conversation is of a is emanating from a paradigm very similar to the one that you just presented, which is that um, the 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 biggest problem of social justice is not that people individually are not empathetic. The biggest problem of social justice are accumulated vestiges of bad social contracts, bad behaviors, bad cultural uh, and moral policies and legal policies that have been accumulated, that that emerged, and that were written, that were accepted and agreed upon in times of profound ignorance, and have carried on, that 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 evolved in times of Stone Age and have been carried on in times of Space Age. And that really is for me the single most urgent problem to tackle. Uh, that of course the enlightenment of the individual is of great value. The ability to the fact that, and really I congratulate you for creating programs that and working with young people to enable them and offer them tools of the civilization, tools of critical thinking, of agency, of insight, of ability, so that they can demand that they at least know what we owe them with that. But the real challenge is in creating a system, is changing the system itself, is working at the level of policy, at the level of local and global policies. So what I'm trying to say, I'll just give an illustration of that, which I use very often. That the if you're standing at the footsteps of of say a public building, of a library, and you see a very you see a, a man on his crutches trying to get to the gate of the library, and you help him up, you help him get up the stairs. um, that that is a consequence of your empathy, and that empathy has emerged, that has evolved in us, in humans and other species, for a very specific survival purpose: survival of kin, survival of community. Because in our natural environments, it's most likely that that individual is our genetic relative. So life has offered us altruism and empathy to ensure that our gene pool will have social contracts of certainty, which which we which will work in a paid forward system. That we may do something for someone which may not immediately be returned to us. The favor may not be immediately returned, but our progeny and our kin would benefit from this paid forward system. And that's really what the machinery of empathy is at an individual level. But working with your city council and mandating that every public library, every public infrastructure has slopes and wheelchairs available for people who do not have the ability to walk, is systemic empathy. And given that there are 7 billion of us on this planet today, our work needs to be focused on systemic empathy, and needs to be focused on creating systems of social justice that will mandate a political infrastructure which does not rely on the mood or the very unreliable, vacillating uh, cognition of the individual at a certain time, at a certain place.
And when you were talking about this, and there was this chapter in Dawkins' book where he talks about this species of birds who, they clean each other's heads because that they can't reach there. So they pair up and they clean each other's heads. And there have been times where, so it's on trust, right? Like the first bird who cleans the other bird's head is the lucky one, because the second one, because that bird may just fly off and leave the other one stranded. So there has to be a sort of, as you would say, like a social contract that both of them will do their bit. And yet there are always these one-off birds who will
Advantage of the system. And
take advantage of the system. but also and then he talks about this game similarly, which students did an experiment where they made them play that, of the same thing of cooperation versus taking
Defect.
advantage of the other player. So if you cooperate, both of you benefit a little less, but both of you benefit, as opposed to if you cheat the other person, only one person benefits. But how long is it sustainable?
And the problem with all these prisoners, and the problem of any prisoner's dilemma game is that if you see it as an individual game, then of course the defecting party is always going to benefit more. But the moment you go into the second round of the game, the defecting party has gone so low in trust that they are likely to be cheated on. They're likely to be, the tit is likely to be met with a tad. And by the way, Khushbu, also to add to your point, sorry, I'm like jumping in. But to add to your point about cooperation in natural environments, there is always this constant negotiation through generations in evolution, in natural evolution, where at any point symbiosis can turn into a commensal relationship. A commensal relationship can turn into a parasitical relationship. So the vampire finch, for example, this was in when Pooja was doing her research on Aesop's fables that we are making, the show about animal behavior. She found that there is a species of vampire finch that also rests upon this larger bird, with the under the symbiotic relationship of cleaning up, eating tiny insects and larvae on the bird's feathers, and at some point along the lines of their co-evolution, the vampire finch started pricking and sucking on a little blood, not so much that the relationship ended, but just enough to feed itself a little more protein than it was due to itself. And that is really what happens between political representatives and people at large. They start drawing ever so little blood.
That sounds like, but no, but the point was also that when you're talking about systemic empathy, the one thing that we've always also spoken about is actually there is no incentive to create systemic empathy. Like there is no incentive anywhere for anyone to create systemic empathy, because when you also take the environment into consideration, right? Like when you take the fact that there is no profit motive to saving the environment. Like there's no corporation who's going to benefit. There's no politician who's going to get votes. So for really good systemic changes, I'm wondering, like, what actually drives those changes, because ultimately, except for public opinion, when it becomes so strong that they demand for it, there is no real incentive.
The idea of incentives and benefits, I think that language, that narrative itself is part of the problem, right?
Yes.
And kind of taking that further, if you look at education itself, right? Education is designed in a linear, cost benefit kind of narrative. You need to get educated, do well in education, go to college, do well, you'll have a good job and you'll have a good quality of life, right? So it's very reductionist, linear approach. And we kind of take that narrative into our life also, and how we look at life, right? If I do this, will it benefit me? Will it help me get a bigger pay, a better job, a better career prospect? Will this relationship help me move forward in life? So, especially at this time, the last 8-9 months, one of the things I've been wondering about, again, in the context of children and young people, is what are the narratives we are giving our young people? In a world that's now today, what one calls a post-truth world, where fake news and misinformation is the norm, where lies has become a norm, right? And there's not even a shame about that, right? We're seeing people lie openly, and then there's polarization and very open division, communal hatred towards one community or other, based on caste, class, religion, whatever. Now, all these, you and me can kind of rationalize and think about it, but and thinking about young minds and what are the narratives they're picking up in the actions of the adults, right? And what is the narrative that the Greta Thunberg picks up when the majority of the world signs a climate agreement but falls short on it massively year on year? And as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, what do you pick up as a narrative? And how are those narratives then shaping how young people then choose to live lives? Yeah. And the choices they make and the kind of future then they shape for us and for the world.
This imaginary conversation I have with children saying, you know, guys, listen, these are the things that we figured out. We gravitational waves, we figured out how to kind of create a tin object and put some fuel on it and shoot it to Mars and land it perfectly. And we figured out how to cure most bacterial and fungal infections. We haven't quite made our way around a lot of viruses. Most diseases we can do these many things with, and we figured out how to produce food for all of humanity, and we figured out how to ensure that most humans lives that are more focused on expanding their consciousness and their enlightenment and their questions and their inquiry and their and whatever they went from. So these are the things that we figured out. And in doing so, we also screwed up the planet quite a bit. We have been unsuccessful in making sure that the food that we've learned how to produce for all of humanity, we've still not managed to redistribute it. Seems like a trivial problem, right? That we have all this food and we know how to produce infinite amount of food, but we still have hungry people. So it seems like a trivial problem. Why is it that we are not able to figure it out? We seem to have produced vaccination for diseases that were around in the 80s. You guys are not going to have these diseases. You know, there used to be diseases called smallpox and polio, and we've mostly done away with most of these. And so we have found vaccination, but we have still not managed to get vaccination across to most humans. And we have failed in doing these things. And while we were at this, we also quite badly screwed up the ecosystem. Okay. So here's a planet you have inherited from us with all this knowledge, with all these wonderful systems, with all this wonderful science and knowledge and tools of wellness, and with all our screw ups. Now go fix it for yourself. Okay. And tell us what curriculum you need for that. And I think the curriculum, the education that you need from that has to be reverse engineered from this singular problem, and everything else details from here on. All education now needs to be reconstituted, reimagined from this singular question: how do we ensure that the next 5 billion people on this planet have access to food, water, shelter, comfort, dignity, education, enlightenment, opportunity, like the first 2 billion almost do? That's a singular question in front of us, staring us. And that means, how do we ensure that there is gender equality? How do we ensure that there is, how do we do away with the vestiges of caste and class? How do we do away with the really bad consequences of this semi-useful software that we invented a few centuries ago called money? Okay, and all education needs to be engineered from the intention to solve these systemic problems. And then you start talking in a completely different language. You are creating systems thinkers. We are enabling systems thinkers, enabling young people right from a very young age to always be able to connect dots, to always be able to see patterns. And to which I said, but did you know all the numbers for your friend? Did you also understand as much as you do today about how, for example, flapping its wings in one part of the earth may be causing tornado in another part, which as somebody who studies, who's a who has an inquiry that you have, and curiosity you have, and curiosity you send it.
Okay, this has to end.
Data capacity and processing capacity to process systemic level, pattern level, very large pattern level thinking. So we, of course, I mean, this is something that we have long established now. We don't necessarily need to teach the next generation tables like we did. We learned them in school. But we need to pass on the tool of abstraction, of understanding that there is a way to symbolize extremely large problems into very specific, consistent metaphors. There is a language, we have a name for this language, we call it mathematics. Mathematics is our metaphorical system that stays consistent. It's the most consistent metaphorical system we have. When we look at pi, the pi does not change in its meaning depending on which region you're or who you're talking to. So it's a very consistent, resilient metaphorical system that we have developed, and we can deploy this system towards solving extremely large problems. We can help them inherit these problems, and these are not going to come by just making them plain classrooms. There are other social or personality related problems that we may be able to solve by enabling them to play or express themselves in classrooms, which we must. But there are higher problems that we confront as a species that are going to require higher thinking, that are going to require the inheritance of the vast human knowledge that we have at our disposal, and we'd have to find methods of really enabling young people to be able to inherit these vast systems and upgrade these vast systems of human knowledge as well, which is the task at hand. It is of course necessary while we are doing that to unburden themselves from having to solve all our problems for us and all their problems for themselves, and say that, hey, listen, we tried to solve as many problems as we could. Here we are, we screwed up a few, but you are not hating us, right? You're here, the world is here, the planet is here, you're all right. While you are at it, have a good time. Yes, do that as well. But at the same time, also remember that these problems are not going to go away by playing. They're not going to go away by wondering and sitting below a tree and painting the sky, and wondering what would it have been if the sky was red or brown or any other color. These problems are going to go away by active use of sciences that you have to work rigorously towards. You have to put in huge effort towards understanding and comprehending the vast systems that you're now inheriting. If you plan to be that individual if you want to be the person who is going to contribute towards a meaningful solution.
This was highly provocative, and I think I could go on, responding to some of the things both Anand and Khushbu that you have shared. But there's a lot of food for thought here, and definitely a lot for us to take back in the way we're thinking about creating systemic empathy and exploring ideas of the future of humanity from the lens of education. So thank you so much for the provocations.
Thank you so much for just initiating and warming up us to this conversation about and also contributing to the reimagining.